I am 104 years old, and I will not waste time pretending there is still a future in which I can correct what I failed to say. When you live as long as I have, you begin to understand that the most dangerous thing a man can carry is not anger, not poverty, not even illness. It is silence. Silence grows heavier with the years. It settles into your bones. It becomes part of your breathing, part of the way you look at the people you love while knowing they have never truly known you. For 40 years, I lived inside a truth that I refused to speak. I convinced myself it was protection. I told myself it was kindness. I said it was sacrifice. A man can create very beautiful words to hide very ugly fears, and I was a master at that. I learned to smile in family photographs while feeling like a stranger in my own life. I learned to listen to my children talk about loyalty and honesty while knowing I had built my entire adulthood on a carefully maintained lie. You must understand something about time. When you are young, you believe secrets are temporary. You believe you will reveal them later, when the moment is right, when circumstances improve, when people are stronger. But later becomes next year. Next year becomes a decade. And then suddenly you are an old man sitting at a table surrounded by people who love you, and you realize the truth has aged alongside you. It has grown roots. It has shaped your destiny in ways you never intended. I am not telling you this to gain sympathy. At my age, sympathy is a useless currency. I am telling you because I can finally see the full map of my life. I can see where fear redirected my path. I can see how one decision made in a single trembling moment quietly determined the emotional climate of 4 decades. Most tragedies do not begin with violence. They begin with hesitation, with a sentence left unfinished, with a confession swallowed at the last possible second. The strange thing about long life is that it gives you perspective, but takes away your illusions. I once believed strength meant endurance. I believed a man proved his character by carrying burdens without complaint. But endurance without truth is not strength. It is slow self-erasure. You become dependable, respected, even admired, and yet internally you feel like a house built on sand, waiting for the inevitable storm. Tonight I am no longer waiting. Tonight I will speak, not because I am brave, but because I am finally tired of being afraid, and because I have learned, too late for myself perhaps, that honesty is not something you practice at the end of life. It is something that determines whether your life ever truly begins. The truth I carried did not begin as a grand betrayal. That is what makes it so difficult to explain. People imagine secrets as dramatic turning points, explosions of passion, reckless crimes, decisions made under extraordinary pressure. My secret began quietly, almost invisibly, in an ordinary season of my life. I was 64 years old then, still strong in body, still proud of the image I had built. A disciplined man, a loyal husband, a reliable father. I had spent decades constructing that identity, brick by brick, until even I believed it was unshakable. But identity is a fragile structure. It only appears solid because we rarely test it against the truth. At that time, I had already retired from the work that had defined me. My days became slower, softer, less structured. For the first time since my youth, I had long stretches of silence in which no one needed anything from me. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. I began to remember the man I had once intended to be, the dreams I had postponed, the risks I had refused, the version of myself that had quietly disappeared beneath responsibility. It was during that season that I met the person who would change the course of my remaining years. I will not dress this in poetic language. It was not a story of sudden passion or reckless romance. It was far more dangerous than that. It was understanding. She saw through the performance I had perfected. She listened in a way that made me feel transparent. When we spoke, I did not feel like a father, a husband, or a retired professional. I felt like a human being who had been given permission to exist without a role. That sensation was intoxicating in a way I had never experienced, not because it was forbidden, but because it was honest. And honesty, when you have lived most of your life inside expectation, feels like oxygen after years of breathing shallow air. At first, I told myself it was harmless. We talked about books, about history, about the quiet fears that come with aging. We walked slowly through parks and discussed the strange loneliness that can settle into a long marriage once the noise of raising children fades. I convinced myself I was not crossing any lines. I was simply rediscovering parts of myself that had been neglected. But self-deception is patient. It does not rush you. It allows you to adjust gradually to new realities until they feel natural. Months passed, then years. My emotional world began to divide into two parallel lives. In one, I was the dependable patriarch my family had always known. In the other, I was a man who spoke freely, laughed without calculation, admitted weakness without shame. I told myself this balance was sustainable. I told myself that protecting my family from the complexity of my inner life was an act of love. What I did not understand then was that love cannot survive indefinitely in an environment built on concealment. There were nights when I sat at the dinner table listening to stories about grandchildren and future plans, and I felt an almost unbearable pressure in my chest. Not guilt alone. Guilt is too simple a word. It was the sensation of being split into two incompatible versions of myself. One version was rooted in loyalty and history. The other was reaching toward authenticity, toward a truth that threatened to dismantle everything I had spent decades preserving. I had opportunities to confess, many of them. Moments when my wife looked at me with quiet curiosity and asked if I was happy. Moments when my eldest son spoke about integrity as though it were the most natural quality a man could possess. Moments when illness visited our home and reminded me that time is never guaranteed. Each of those moments felt like a door opening. Each time I chose to keep walking past it. Fear is rarely dramatic. It is often logical, reasonable, even compassionate in its arguments. I told myself the revelation would destroy the stability my family depended on. I imagined the disappointment in their eyes, the fracture of trust that could never be repaired. I saw in my mind the long echo of pain that honesty might create. And so I decided that silence was the lesser cruelty. Years turned into decades. The relationship that had once felt like a lifeline became something more complicated. It was no longer only about connection, it was about dependency. I had built a private refuge, and I no longer knew how to live without it. At the same time, I remained deeply attached to the family life I had created. I loved my wife, I loved my children, I loved the history we shared. This was the paradox that defined my later years. Genuine love existing alongside profound dishonesty. As I entered my 80s, the weight of this double existence began to manifest physically. Sleep became shallow. My heart carried a constant rhythm of unease. Doctors spoke about age-related decline, about the inevitability of slowing systems. But inside, I knew something else was happening. The human body keeps score of emotional contradictions. It records the tension between what we present and what we suppress. I remember one particular evening with unsettling clarity. We were celebrating a family milestone. Laughter filled the room. My grandchildren were running between chairs, inventing games only children understand. Someone asked me to give a speech. I stood there, looking at the faces that represented the best parts of my life, and I felt a sudden surge of panic. Not because I did not love them, but because I realized how incomplete their understanding of me truly was. I spoke politely, even eloquently. I praised loyalty, resilience, gratitude. Everyone applauded. But as I sat down, I felt as though I had just delivered a performance at my own trial. From that night forward, the secret no longer felt manageable. It felt urgent. Yet urgency did not translate into action. Instead, it deepened my internal conflict. I began to withdraw slightly from both worlds. Conversations became shorter. My laughter grew measured. I developed the habit of staring out of windows for long periods, as though the horizon might offer instructions. The person who had once given me a sense of authenticity also began to sense the change. She spoke about time, about the inevitability of endings, about the quiet cruelty of waiting for decisions that never arrive. There was no dramatic confrontation, only a gradual recognition that we had built something that could not be sustained indefinitely. When she finally left my life, the silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was not peaceful. It was not relieving. It was vast and echoing. For the first time, I was forced to sit entirely with the consequences of my own hesitation. I had neither protected my family from eventual pain nor secured the honest life I once imagined. I had simply postponed truth until it became too entangled to resolve cleanly. In the years that followed, I devoted myself even more intensely to being the reliable elder everyone expected. I attended every celebration, offered every piece of advice, played the role of wisdom with convincing precision. Outwardly, my life appeared dignified and complete. Inwardly, I was conducting a quiet audit of my choices, trying to understand how a man can love deeply and still live dishonestly. Now, at 104, the arithmetic of my life is clear. Secrets do not remain contained. They shape your posture, your tone of voice, the way you interpret every expression of trust. They create invisible distances that no amount of routine affection can fully bridge. And eventually they demand recognition. This is why I am speaking now. Not because the story itself is extraordinary, but because the pattern is common. Many men of my generation believed endurance was the highest virtue. We believed that if we absorbed our conflicts privately, we were protecting the people around us. We did not realize that unspoken truths have a way of leaking into every interaction, every decision, every moment of silence at the dinner table. I am not asking for judgment. Judgment is irrelevant at this stage. What matters is clarity. And clarity, I have discovered, is often born from the painful examination of the paths we were too afraid to walk when we still had time. There comes a point in very long lives when memory stops behaving like a simple record of events. It becomes something closer to a courtroom. Faces reappear not as they were, but as witnesses. Moments return not as nostalgia, but as testimony. You begin to hear questions inside your own mind that no one ever asked aloud. Why did you stay silent? What exactly were you protecting? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who were you trying to convince? For many years after she left, I tried to believe that the chapter had closed. I told myself that distance would dissolve the emotional complexity I had created. I buried myself in routine. I took pride in being the dependable presence at family gatherings, the calm voice during disagreements, the steady hand when illness visited our home. Outwardly, I fulfilled every expectation placed upon an aging patriarch. Inwardly, I felt like a man who had survived a shipwreck but never spoken about the ocean. It was in my late 80s that the true reckoning began. My wife became ill, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow erosion that often accompanies advanced age. At first it was small lapses, a forgotten appointment, a misplaced object, a question repeated twice in the same conversation. Then came longer stretches of confusion, moments when she would look at me with an expression that was both trusting and distant, as though she recognized my presence but not the history behind it. Illness has a way of rearranging priorities with ruthless efficiency. The abstract debates we conduct in our younger years about freedom, authenticity, personal fulfillment become secondary to the simple urgency of care. I devoted myself entirely to her well-being. I learned the language of medications, the rhythms of hospital corridors, the quiet diplomacy required when speaking to exhausted nurses. I sat beside her through nights that seemed longer than entire decades of my past. And yet, even in that devotion, the unspoken truth remained. It hovered between us like an invisible third presence. There were moments, particularly in the fragile clarity that sometimes follows confusion, when she would ask questions that felt like arrows finding their mark. She would take my hand and say very softly, "Were you happy, truly happy all these years?" It was not an accusation. It was not even curiosity in the ordinary sense. It was the instinct of a woman who had shared a life with me and sensed that some essential part of my story had always remained just out of reach. Each time I gave her reassuring answers. I spoke about gratitude, about shared memories, about the blessings of longevity. I convinced myself that preserving her peace was more important than exposing the fractures beneath our history. But every such conversation left a residue inside me, a quiet knowledge that I was still choosing comfort over truth. As her condition progressed, communication became increasingly difficult. Words began to fail her. Sentences dissolved midway through formation. Eventually, she spoke less and less, retreating into a private landscape I could not follow. In those final months, I often wondered whether she understood more than she could express. There were times when she would look at me with an intensity that felt almost unbearable, as though she were searching for confirmation of something she had suspected for years. The night she died was profoundly still. Hospitals are rarely silent, but that night felt suspended outside ordinary time. Machines had been disconnected. The clinical routines had paused. It was just the two of us in a dimly lit room, holding hands as we had done thousands of times before. I remember thinking that this was the last opportunity I would ever have to speak without consequence. I did not speak. Fear, after 40 years, had become instinctive. I told myself that confession at that moment would serve no purpose. I rationalized that truth delivered too late could only create confusion. So I sat there, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing, and allowed the final chapter of our shared life to close without revealing the hidden pages. Grief is complicated when mixed with regret. In the months that followed her passing, I experienced not only the expected loneliness of loss, but also the unsettling realization that my silence was now permanent. The person who had deserved honesty more than anyone else was no longer present to receive it. I had preserved stability at the cost of authenticity, and the price of that decision had become irreversible. It was during this period that I began to write, not for publication, not for family, but as a private exercise in accountability. I filled notebooks with memories I had previously avoided examining in detail. I described the early days of The Secret, the rationalizations that had seemed so persuasive at the time, the gradual entanglement of affection and dependency, the countless opportunities for truth that I had declined. Writing forced me to confront an uncomfortable pattern. The secret itself, the emotional bond I had formed outside my marriage, was not the only defining element of my story. More significant was my persistent belief that I could control the timing of honesty. I had treated truth like a resource to be deployed strategically rather than a foundation upon which a life must stand from the beginning. As I entered my 90s, my children began to assume greater responsibility for my daily needs. Roles reversed in subtle ways. They monitored my medications, advised me about travel, spoke gently about the importance of rest. I watched them navigate their own marriages, their own moments of uncertainty, and I felt an increasing urgency to offer guidance that went beyond polite generalities. But guidance without context felt hollow. How could I speak about integrity while concealing the most formative moral conflict of my later years? There was one afternoon, not long after my 95th birthday, when this tension reached a breaking point. We were sitting in the garden of my eldest son's home. The air carried the scent of wet soil after rain. He was describing a disagreement he had been having with his wife. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary friction that accumulates in long relationships. He asked me with genuine vulnerability how a man knows when to persist in silence and when to risk painful honesty. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Here was another door opening, This time I spoke, but only partially. I told him that silence can become a habit, that avoidance often disguises itself as patience. I encouraged him to choose clarity before resentment had time to grow roots. He listened carefully, thanked me, and the conversation moved on. Yet I walked away with the unsettling awareness that I had again withheld the deeper truth that could have transformed my advice into something far more authentic. Years continued to pass. Friends disappeared one by one, leaving behind empty chairs at gatherings that grew progressively quieter. My world contracted in physical terms while expanding in reflective depth. I began to understand that longevity is not only a biological phenomenon, it is also an ethical challenge. The longer you live, the more opportunities you have to examine the coherence between your values and your actions. At 100, I celebrated with my family. There were speeches, photographs, a cake far larger than my appetite could accommodate. I smiled for the cameras, grateful for their love, yet increasingly aware that celebration without confession felt incomplete. I had become a symbol of endurance, of resilience, of admirable longevity. Few suspected that beneath that image lay a narrative defined as much by hesitation as by strength. Now, 4 years later, the arithmetic of time has become undeniable. My body moves slowly, my hearing is selective, sleep comes in fragmented intervals. But my mind, paradoxically, feels sharper than ever in its moral clarity. I can no longer pretend that silence serves any constructive purpose. The people I sought to protect are themselves seasoned by life. They have faced disappointments, losses, and their own complex decisions. They are capable of understanding nuance. This is why the secret must finally be spoken in its entirety. Not to reopen wounds, not to dramatize my remaining days, but to align the final chapter of my life with the truth that should have guided it decades ago. I do not expect absolution. What I seek is coherence. The quiet dignity of leaving this world without unfinished sentences lodged in my conscience. In the next part of my story, I will describe the moment when I gathered my family and allowed the carefully maintained narrative of 4 decades to dissolve. It was not a scene of theatrical confrontation. It was something far more human, a room filled with history, uncertainty, and the fragile possibility that honesty, even when delayed, can still illuminate the meaning of a life. I chose a quiet afternoon to tell them. Not a holiday, not a birthday, not a moment already heavy with expectation. Just an ordinary day when the sunlight fell gently across the living room floor and the world outside seemed uninterested in what was about to unfold inside our family. I asked them to sit with me, my sons, my daughter, their spouses, even the grandchildren who were old enough to sense that something serious was happening. At 104, you do not command attention through authority anymore. You receive it through fragility. They listened because they could see time written on my face. They listened because somewhere in their instincts they understood that this was not another story about the past, but a truth that would shape how they remembered me. I did not speak dramatically. I did not defend myself. I simply described the long season of silence that had divided my inner life from the role I played in our home. I told them about the emotional bond I had hidden, about the years I believed concealment was an act of protection, about the regret that followed me into old age like a shadow that never shortened. I admitted that fear, not love, not sacrifice, had been the true architect of my decision. There was pain in the room. I would be dishonest if I pretended otherwise. Some eyes filled with tears, some faces hardened in quiet disappointment. One of my grandchildren left the room for a while because the man she thought she knew had suddenly become more complicated. Yet there was also something else present, something I had not allowed myself to imagine for 40 years. There was understanding, not immediate forgiveness, not simple resolution, but the beginning of a more honest relationship with my own history. My children asked questions that were direct yet compassionate. They spoke about the weight of expectations in their own lives, about the ways they too had sometimes chosen silence out of fear. In that moment, the secret stopped being a wall between us and became a difficult bridge we were learning to cross together. What I discovered that day is this: truth delayed is painful, but truth denied is corrosive. It eats quietly at the foundation of every meaningful connection. Had I spoken earlier, the consequences might have been sharper, more chaotic, perhaps even destructive in the short term. But silence carried its own long-term cost, a subtle distance that no amount of routine affection could fully erase. Now, as I sit near the end of a century-long journey, I understand that courage is not measured by how much suffering a man can endure in private. It is measured by his willingness to be seen as he truly is, even when that truth disrupts the image he has spent a lifetime protecting. My confession did not rewrite the past. It did not restore the years I lived divided between honesty and fear. But it did give my remaining days a sense of coherence I had never felt before. If there is a lesson in my story, it is not about betrayal or late redemption. It is about timing. Do not wait for age to give you permission to speak the truths that shape your life. Do not assume that silence is kindness. Often the most generous act you can offer the people you love is the difficult clarity of honesty, while there is still time for understanding to grow. I am 104 years old. My voice is weaker now, but my conscience is finally quiet. And in this quiet, I have found a peace that no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, could ever provide.